Hey, what is going on, guys? Max Settings here, and welcome back to another review. In today's review, we are going to be taking a look at the Focal Utopia. Now, before we get into today's review, I have to give a big shout out to headphones.com for sending this unit out for review. Headphones.com is the online audio retailer with the 365-day return policy. So if you buy something from them, you have a full 365 days to decide if you want to keep it or return it for a full refund. So once again, big thanks to them for sending these out for review, and without further ado, let's get on into the video. Now, starting with a little overview of this headphone, this is Focal's current flagship offering, the Utopia, and it is coming in at a $4,000 price point. And I guess with that, let's go ahead and knock specs out of the way. So the Utopia is coming in at a $4,000 MSRP. It is using an 80 ohm dynamic driver with a sensitivity of 104 dB a milliwatt, a frequency response of 5 to 50,000 hertz, and a weight of 490 grams. So let's go ahead and do the accessories and the packaging real quick. So I'll move the headphones out of the way. So the Utopia actually recently also got a premium version upgrade, and that now increases the price to $4,400, although this option that I'm showing you here is also still available for the $4,000 price. So you get this leather box. It says Utopia on it on the front of the lid here, Focal on the top. And if you open it up, there's some nice foam inside of it. If I don't hit my camera, then you can see in the box, which is where your headphones sit along with the cable. And I will go ahead and move this out of the way. And then as for the cable, the $4,000 version comes with this monstrosity of a 13-foot cable. Quarter-inch cable, 13 feet thick, really heavy. It really weighs down the headphones, and like they feel like they're pulling on your head. And then they use a LEMO connector, a different style connector than what the HD800 uses. But this is a complete garbage cable, and it should absolutely be replaced if you buy a version of this. Now, of note, the more expensive $4,400 version has the same box, case, and cables as the Focal Stellia, for those of you that saw my review of that, only in black instead of that like brown tannish color that the Stellia is in. So you can decide if that's up to you. I wasn't a fan of even the cables the Stellia came with. They were also kind of stiff, but they are a lot better than this super heavy 13-foot snake of a cable. So definitely replace the cable on these if you get a pair. Okay, so now let's move on into the build of this headphone. So this is Focal's flagship headphone, and there are a few things that distinguish this from their lower-end models. I would say first and foremost is the carbon fiber yokes. You can see the yokes of this headphone are made entirely of carbon fiber. You also have a very different grill and cup design compared to the lower-end models, and this headphone is using a beryllium driver, and there are a lot of advantages to beryllium. It's also made in France, says Fabrique in France on the headphones there. And you have a metal grill. This little piece here is kind of a plastic, and then like the silver metal grill. You can see the back of the driver. The sides of the cups are glossy plastic, which I'm not a huge fan of. Not usually a fan of glossy plastic. On the bottom, you can see the LEMO connectors, which is actually quite a nice connector. And then you have perforated leather pads there on the headphone, and about the same style headband as every other Focal headphone. Now, some of the older versions of this, people said squeaked, and this one is not too bad. There's like a little bit of like squeaky rattle, but not nearly as bad as other pairs that I've seen. So I'm not sure if they have fixed this. This is a brand new pair. I am the first person to use this pair of Utopias. So may have been fixed since the early pairs of the Utopia. So that is the overall build of these. Now moving on into the comfort segment, the Utopia is kind of in a weird uncanny valley for me. It's not uncomfortable, but it's not like super comfortable. It's in this weird like uncanny valley of It never really hurts me. Like, I never get any like discomfort on the top of my head or the side of my head or my ears. But at the same time, I'm always like really well aware that it's there. It like never disappears, if that makes sense. It's like something you're always very consciously aware is on your head, even though it doesn't really hurt you. Whereas some headphones that are more comfortable almost seem to disappear and you kind of forget that you're wearing them after a while. With this, I never really got that sensation. I always was well aware that it was on my head. So it's kind of in a weird, uncanny valley. I could definitely see this headband being a problem for some people. It has a decent weight to it, 490 grams. And that much with no suspension strap could bother some people. If your ears are bigger, I could also see maybe hitting the inside of the cup, but I personally did not have that issue. The clamping force is not too bad. So overall, I would say it's a comfortable headphone, but it's not like super comfortable, at least for me personally. Now, as for power requirements, the Utopia is not hard to drive in the sense of needing power. It's a fairly low impedance and it's pretty efficient. However, it is hard to drive in the sense that it is very source picky. This headphone is very source revealing and shows off differences between amps and DACs very well. And it changes a lot depending on what you plug it into, going from like solid state to tube or different solid state to different solid state. It's definitely a very picky headphone, but it is definitely not a hard to drive headphone like an iPhone would. Get this up to listening volume without much problem, but you may find it sounds not very good on particular sources, but other ones it sounds quite good on. So it's very picky with sources. You are going to need to play around to find something that it pairs well with. And if you ever wanted to know or try to find differences between DACs and amps, this is another great headphone to do it with. The other one that I use a lot is the HD 800 over here. Okay, so now let's hop on into the sound of the Focal Utopia. So starting off with frequency response, as always, the Utopia has a pretty good bass extension for a dynamic driver headphone. There is a little bit of roll off that starts, I don't know, around 50 or 60 hertz and seems to roll off maybe like 4-ish dB by the time you hit 20. So good bass extension for a dynamic, but not quite as dead flat as a planar magnetic headphone, especially at this price point. After that, you have a little bit of like 1.5K shout, and then your mids roll off a little bit in typical Focal fashion at around like 2, 3, 4K. They kind of roll off a couple dB, and then your treble comes back up for I'd say a slightly above neutral treble region in that like 9 to 10K. It has a little bit of that, like that 9 to 10K treble peak. That some people find grating, but I don't find it too bad personally. I don't find it overly bright, but I do see how some people could say that it's on the brighter side. So this is a fairly typical Focal frequency response. Nothing too crazy. It's a little different from the Alexa Clear, but I'd say it sticks to the Focal house sound more or less. Now, let's talk about the staging and imaging, and I actually want to do detail last. So the staging on the Utopia, I would say, is probably one of its greatest weaknesses. The Utopia has a very small overall soundstage. I personally don't think it's much bigger than like an HD 650 or something along those lines. But what it does very well is layering and imaging. It has a very nice and precise image within that very small stage with very nice layering, where the Sennheisers are more like that 3 blob thing. So it is a smaller stage, but very nice imaging and layering with this headphone. The other area where it kind of suffers in terms of stage is not just side to side, but front to back. Front to back stage is also very small compared to other headphones here, like the 800 or the Borealis over here. Now, as for dynamics, that has always been one area where Focals shine. The Utopia is a very dynamic headphone. It has very good microdynamics, very good macrodynamics, and it's very good at slam. These Focal drivers really move a lot, and they move a lot of air, and they're very, very punchy, very dynamic, very good at micro details and dynamic contrast, and they slam really hard, particularly on a good source. So the Utopia is very dynamic. Most of you know that I'm a sucker for dynamics, and I find this headphone very dynamic and definitely up there with some of the best dynamics that you can get in a headphone. Now, as for timbre, the Utopia is definitely a little bit on the metallic side. All the Focals are. This one is no exception. It has definitely a little bit of a metallic twinge or characteristic to its treble, which is what you would expect from a Focal headphone, but it's not egregiously so, just a little bit so. Okay, so now I think is a good time to talk about detail. So the Utopia is sitting here at a $4,000 price point, and the thing that I've always seen online is Utopia or HD800 for detail. And I sat here for hours over a couple days going back and forth between the 800 and the Utopia on different tracks, and man, I am still almost undecided. Some tracks I think the 800 is more detailed, some I think the Utopia is more detailed, and I know it's just the differences in FR. The 800 is brighter, so I know the treble may be tricking me at some tracks, but man, we are splitting hairs here to see which one of these is more detailed. Now the 800 is definitely a lot cheaper than the Utopia, and I do think it really holds its own compared to the Utopia in terms of detail. And honestly, which one's more detailed is frankly a toss-up. If I had to pick, I think I might still lean 800, but it's really close. It's really a toss-up. I don't think the Utopia is like insanely detailed for a $4,000 price point, but it's still definitely one of the more detailed headphones that you can currently buy. Now, also compared to the Borealis here, the Borealis holds its own in detail compared to the 800 and the Utopia for sure. It's a little bit behind, but it definitely holds its own, and we will be talking about the Utopia compared to the Borealis in just a bit here. Okay, so now let's hop on into comparisons. So the two comparisons that I wanted to start with are comparing the Utopia here to, I would say, two of the premier dynamic driver headphones currently available on the market, in my opinion, which are the Sennheiser HD800, which this is my red painted pair of them, and the Aurorus Audio Borealis. So, like I mentioned earlier, the Utopia versus 800 has been pretty much a debate since the Utopia came out. The 800 has a much wider stage. The HD800 is known as one of the widest headphones that you can buy in terms of staging. It has a much, much wider stage than the Utopia, although I don't think it images quite as well because the 800 has a little bit of a vague center just because of how wide it is. Now, the Utopia has a much better overall tonality than the HD800 does, in my opinion. I much prefer this signature and tonality, and the 800's tonality has never been that great. The Utopia, while bright, is definitely less bright than the 800 and does not have that annoying 6K peak that the HD800 is known for. So overall, I prefer the frequency response of this. But the HD800 is more analytical sounding if you prefer that. I think most people probably are not going to prefer that. But if you prefer that, the 800 it definitely has that more analytical sound with that wider stage. I think most people will also find it more comfortable because it is quite a bit lighter with the much deeper ear cups. So the HD800 holds its own, but personally for what I like, I would take Utopia over HD800, but you can't deny the value proposition of the HD800, especially used. You can get a used one for like $700-800 compared to $4,000 for this new used, or hanging like $2,000 ish. So good value proposition on this, but this is a much better tonality. And I think it's also a little bit more dynamic than the HD800, even though the HD800 is quite a dynamic headphone. Now, I mentioned this in my review of the Borealis that some people were comparing it to the Utopia. And I also spent quite a bit of time A/Bing it to the Utopia, which the Borealis here. And the results were definitely quite interesting. Now, I know a lot of you say this headphone's a scam, it's $11 drivers, yada, yada, yada. It sounds great. Now, obviously, the build is definitely a sacrifice over the Utopia. But we have $4,000 MSRP versus $900 MSRP. The Borealis here is even better and more natural of a tonality than the Utopia, in my opinion. This is definitely aiming more towards the Sennheiser 600 series in terms of tonality, which is what I mentioned in the review of the Borealis. I also think the timbre on the Borealis is better than the Utopia is. The Borealis has a little bit metallic to it, but not as bad as the Utopia. I also think the Borealis is more dynamic than the Utopia. Not tremendously so, but going back and forth, the Borealis has a much punchy, or not much, but has slightly punchier bass than the Utopia did overall, and I think has even better dynamic contrast than the Utopia does. It also has a much wider stage than the Utopia does, and it also has quite good layering. I'd say also about on par with the Utopia, and has a much bigger front to back image than the Utopia does. Now, the Utopia I still think is a good bit more detailed than the Borealis, but the Borealis is not as far behind as you would think. The value proposition of this for $900 is still really, really good compared to the Utopia. But the Utopia is still arguably the king of overall detail in a dynamic driver headphone. The Borealis, I think, hits a more natural tone and frequency response and timbre compared to the Utopia, with a wider stage and slightly better dynamics. But the Utopia, for straight all-out resolution, definitely wins in that regard. Now, other headphones that it would compete with, the Odyssey LCD4 is also $4,000. Much heavier, worse FR. I think, frankly, it does slam harder than the Utopia does. The LCD4 slams super hard, which is one of the hardest slamming headphones that I have heard. But the FR is definitely a lot worse than the Utopia with the big mid-range dip. But if you EQ it, that's a different story. So LCD4 versus Utopia, I think I'm going to lean towards the 4, but I could definitely see taking this over the 4. See, the other one, the Susvara, I think, but that's $6,000. That's 50% more than this. That one, I think I probably also would take over the Utopia because I do like the HiFiMAN signature. HE1000 is also $3,000. I think I would take Utopia over HE1000 just because the HE1000 I find a little bit lacking in terms of overall slam and dynamics compared to the Utopia. So the Utopia holds its own for a $4,000 price point compared to other similarly priced flagships. However, you can't really deny how much cheaper these are on the used market. You literally can save 50%, if not more. I've seen pairs as low as like $1,800-$1,900. So it's really hard to justify spending the full $4,000 when you can get it lightly used for half off, literally. But if you want to compare to other $4,000 headphones, I think it does hold its own quite well. And the Utopia is quite a good headphone, and it does get my recommendation. I really, really like it. And I will be comparing it to the ZMF Verite in the coming weeks, so look forward to that review. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed my review of the Focal Utopia. Links of where to buy this in the description below, as well as my Twitter, the ears graph, and all other relevant information. Once again, big thanks to headphones.com for loaning me this Utopia for review. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the review. Look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.